April 1964. The morning fog rolled thick off San Diego Bay, wrapping the quiet residential streets of North Park in a gray shroud that muffled sound and softened edges. At 6:47 a.m., 3 black and white patrol cars pulled up to a modest craftsman bungalow at 3847 Utah Street, their red lights cutting through the mist like warning flares. Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman, 72 years old, had been watering her prize-winning roses when she noticed her neighbor's front door standing open, swaying slightly in the coastal breeze. What began as concern for a possible burglary transformed into the discovery that would haunt San Diego for the next 6 decades. If you're interested in true crime cases with details that mainstream coverage leaves out, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because what we're about to uncover will change everything you thought you knew about this case. Jennifer Marie Caldwell was born on March 15, 1945, to Robert and Patricia Caldwell in the Hillcrest neighborhood of San Diego. Standing 5 feet 4 inches tall with dark brown hair that she wore in the popular flip style of the era, Jennifer had inherited her mother's hazel eyes and her father's determined chin. Robert worked as an assistant manager at a Chevron station on University Avenue, while Patricia took in sewing to supplement the family income. Jennifer was the middle child, with an older brother, Thomas, who was serving in the Navy, and a younger sister, Susan, who was 14 at the time of Jennifer's death. Jenny was the glue that held us together, Patricia Caldwell would later recall in a 1989 interview. She had this way of making everyone feel special, like they were the only person in the room. Even when money was tight, she never complained. She just smiled and found something to be grateful for. Jennifer had graduated from Hoover High School in June 1963, where she'd been a member of the drama club and the school newspaper. Her English teacher, Margaret Sullivan, remembered her as extraordinarily empathetic, the kind of student who would stay after class to make sure a struggling classmate understood the assignment. Jennifer's dream was to become a registered nurse. She'd been accepted into the nursing program at San Diego Community College and was working 2 part-time jobs to save money for her education, waitressing at Oscar's Drive-In on El Cajon Boulevard during evenings and working as a file clerk at Mercy Hospital on weekday mornings. In the spring of 1964, San Diego was a city caught between eras. The post-war optimism that had defined the 1950s was beginning to crack, though the full turbulence of the late 60s had not yet arrived. The population hovered around 573,000, and North Park was a working-class neighborhood where families knew each other, where children played kick-the-can in the streets until the streetlights came on, and where front doors were often left unlocked. The community centered around small businesses along University Avenue, hardware stores, Five and Dimes, soda fountains, and the Fox Theater, where teenagers gathered on Friday nights. The naval presence dominated the city's economy and culture. Sailors in their dress whites were a common sight downtown, and military families cycled through the area in waves. It was a socially conservative time when young women like Jennifer were expected to be home by 10 o'clock, and racial segregation, though not legally enforced, was still practiced in many neighborhoods and establishments. The assassination of President Kennedy 5 months earlier had shaken the nation's sense of security, but San Diego still felt insulated, safe, far from the violence that seemed to plague larger cities back east. April 16, 1964, began as an ordinary Thursday for Jennifer Caldwell. 6:15 a.m. Jennifer's alarm clock rang in the small bedroom she shared with her sister Susan at the family home on Kansas Street. 6:30 a.m. Patricia Caldwell heard the shower running and began making coffee in the percolator. 6:50 a.m. Jennifer came down to breakfast wearing her work uniform, a crisp white blouse and navy blue skirt, and ate a piece of toast with jam while reviewing her schedule for the day. She was excited, Susan would later tell investigators. She'd just gotten word that she'd been promoted to senior file clerk at the hospital. It meant 50 cents more an hour. 7:15 m. Jennifer kissed her mother goodbye and walked the 4 blocks to the bus stop at the corner of Utah Street and University Avenue. A neighbor, Mr. Frank Peterson, saw her waiting and waved from his front porch. She smiled and waved back, he recalled. She was always friendly like that. 7:33 a.m. Jennifer boarded the number 11 bus heading downtown. The driver, Harold Chen, would later remember her paying her 15-cent fare and taking a seat near the front. She had a book with her, Chen testified. I remember thinking she seemed like a nice girl, studious. 8:05 a.m. Jennifer arrived at Mercy Hospital and clocked in at the administrative office on the second floor. Her supervisor, Mrs. Dorothy Klein, noted that Jennifer seemed in good spirits and mentioned she was planning to meet her friend Carol after work to see a movie at the Loma Theatre 12:30 p.m. Jennifer took her lunch break in the hospital cafeteria. She sat with two other clerks, Mary Brennan and Louise Waters. We talked about the Beatles, Mary later stated. Jenny said she was saving up to buy their new album. She was humming, I Want to Hold Your Hand when she left. 3:05 p.m. Jennifer's shift ended. She clocked out and was seen leaving through the main entrance by security guard James Morrison 3:45 p.m. This is where Jennifer's confirmed timeline ends. She never arrived at Oscar's Drive-In for her evening shift, which was scheduled to begin at 4:30 p.m. Her manager, Mr. Howard Phillips, called the Caldwell home at 5:15 p.m. when Jennifer failed to show up, which was completely unlike her. Patricia Caldwell immediately knew something was wrong. The discovery came the following morning when Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman noticed the open door at 3847 Utah Street, a small rental house 3 blocks from where Jennifer's bus route passed. The house belonged to a landlord who rented it to transient workers, and it had been vacant for 2 weeks. Mrs. Hoffman called the police, thinking vagrants might have broken in. Officer Raymond Tucker arrived at 6:52 a.m. and entered the house. In the back bedroom, he found Jennifer Marie Caldwell. She was lying on her back on a bare mattress, still wearing her work clothes. The cause of death would later be determined as manual strangulation. The coroner, Dr. Philip Reardon, estimated time of death between 4:00 p.m. and 6:00 p.m. on April 16th. The scene was disturbingly orderly. Jennifer's purse sat on a chair near the door, its contents undisturbed. Her wallet contained $3.27. Her shoes were placed neatly at the foot of the mattress. There were no signs of forced entry to the house. Evidence collected included a partial shoe print near the back door in what appeared to be dried mud, measuring size 10 men's, 2 cigarette butts found in an ashtray in the kitchen, brand determined to be Lucky Strike, several blonde hairs on Jennifer's clothing that did not match her dark brown hair, a torn button from Jennifer's blouse found under the bed, fiber evidence from the mattress, and a single fingerprint on the bedroom doorknob that did not match Jennifer's. I've been doing this job for 15 years, Officer Tucker told the San Diego Union. But you never get used to seeing something like this. She was just a kid, somebody's daughter. The North Park community reacted with shock and fear. Within days, hardware stores sold out of door locks and chain bolts. Parents began driving their teenage daughters to work rather than letting them take the bus. We thought we were safe here, longtime resident Martha Gibson told reporters. This was the kind of neighborhood where everyone looked out for each other. How could this happen? Have you ever felt safe in your neighborhood only to have that sense of security shattered? Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments how this case resonates with your own community's experience. The San Diego Police Department in 1964 was a relatively small operation with just over 600 officers serving the entire city. The detective division had only 12 investigators handling all major crimes. Homicide cases were rare. San Diego averaged fewer than 20 murders per year, and the department had limited experience with stranger murders. The lead detective assigned to Jennifer's case was Lieutenant Frank Morrison, a 20-year veteran known for his meticulous note-taking, but working with technology that seems primitive by today's standards. There were no DNA databases, no computerized fingerprint matching systems, no surveillance cameras. Evidence was photographed with bulky speed graphic cameras. Fingerprints were matched by hand using magnifying glasses, and witness statements were recorded on typewriters. The investigation initially focused on 5 primary suspects: Harold Wayne Simmons, age 29, unemployed merchant marine. Simmons had been seen in the North Park area in the days before Jennifer's murder, and neighbors reported he'd been asking about vacant houses. He had a previous conviction for assault in 1959. Investigators discovered that Simmons matched the general physical description provided by a witness who claimed to see a man near the Utah Street house on the afternoon of April 16th. His alibi was that he'd been drinking at a bar on Fifth Avenue from noon until evening. The bartender, Mickey Delano, confirmed Simmons had been there, but couldn't pinpoint exact times. When police searched Simmons's rooming house, they found nothing connecting him to Jennifer. The fingerprint from the crime scene didn't match his, and he was eventually cleared after passing a polygraph examination. Robert Bobby Delgado, age 22, construction worker. Delgado had briefly attended Hoover High School at the same time as Jennifer, though they hadn't been in the same grade. He'd asked her out once in 1962, and she'd declined. Witnesses reported seeing him near Mercy Hospital on several occasions, leading investigators to suspect he might have been following Jennifer. Delgado's alibi was that he'd been working a construction site in La Jolla on April 16th until 6:00 p.m. His time card confirmed his presence, and 3 co-workers verified he'd been there all afternoon. Additionally, his shoe size was 8.5, not matching the print found at the scene. After extensive questioning, Delgado was ruled out Martin Lee Hooper, age 34, insurance salesman. Hooper was known to police from a 1961 incident where a young woman had filed a complaint alleging he'd followed her home from a bus stop, though no charges were filed. He lived just 6 blocks from the crime scene and was known to smoke Lucky Strike cigarettes, matching the brand found at the scene. When questioned, Hooper claimed he'd been home alone on the afternoon of April 16th, having called in sick to work. His wife verified this, stating he'd been in bed with the flu. However, investigators were suspicious of the convenient alibi. A search of his home revealed nothing incriminating, and the fingerprint from the doorknob didn't match his. Hair samples taken from Hooper were dark brown, not blonde like those found on Jennifer's clothing. Without physical evidence linking him to the crime, detectives had no grounds to hold him, and he was released after 48 hours of questioning William Bill Patrick Sullivan, age 41, employed as a maintenance worker at Mercy Hospital. Sullivan had access to employee records and would have known Jennifer's schedule. He'd been divorced twice and had a reputation among hospital staff as someone who made inappropriate comments to younger female employees. Dr. Helen Crawford, a physician at Mercy, had reported Sullivan to administration in March 1964 for making unwanted advances toward a nursing student. Investigators considered Sullivan a strong suspect because of his proximity to Jennifer and his questionable behavior. His alibi was that he'd been at the hospital performing repairs until 5 p.m. on April 16th, then had gone directly to his apartment on Park Boulevard. His supervisor confirmed he'd clocked out at 5:07 p.m. However, the hospital was only a 15-minute drive from the Utah Street house, leaving a window of opportunity. Sullivan's shoe size was 10, matching the print at the crime scene, which intensified scrutiny. He was interviewed 7 times over the course of 3 weeks. "I barely knew the girl," Sullivan insisted during his final interview. "I saw her in the hallways maybe. That's it. I didn't do this." Ultimately, Sullivan's fingerprints didn't match the one from the doorknob, and investigators couldn't place him at the vacant house. The case against him was circumstantial at best, and he was never charged. Thomas Albert Reynolds, age 26, medical student at UC San Diego. Reynolds had no criminal history, but came to investigators' attention through an unusual route. A fellow student reported that Reynolds had been obsessed with crime scene photography and had extensive files of newspaper clippings about murders. When police interviewed Reynolds, they found him odd and evasive, with poor social skills that made him seem suspicious. He admitted to having seen Jennifer at Mercy Hospital during his clinical rotations and described her as pretty. Reynolds claimed he'd been studying at the university library on April 16th from 2 p.m. until 8 p.m. Library records showed he'd checked out books that afternoon, but there was no way to verify he'd remained there the entire time. "I'm interested in forensic pathology," Reynolds explained. "That's why I have those clippings. I want to be a medical examiner someday. That doesn't make me a killer." Investigators spent considerable resources investigating Reynolds, even consulting with a psychiatrist about whether his behavior indicated homicidal tendencies. The psychiatrist found Reynolds socially awkward, but not dangerous. Like the others, his fingerprints didn't match the crime scene evidence, and there was no physical proof connecting him to Jennifer's death. He was eventually cleared, but left San Diego shortly after, transferring to a medical school in Northern California. The evidence collected from the Utah Street house sat in the police department's property room, carefully catalogued but yielding few answers. The fingerprint on the doorknob had been run through local files with no matches. The blonde hairs were preserved but couldn't be analyzed beyond basic microscopy. DNA testing wouldn't exist for another 2 decades. The cigarette butts were tested for saliva type, revealing the smoker had type A blood, which narrowed the suspect pool only slightly, since roughly 40% of the population shares that blood type. The shoe print was photographed and measured, but without a suspect's shoe to compare it to, it remained just another piece of circumstantial evidence. By August 1964, the investigation had stalled. Lieutenant Morrison had interviewed over 150 people, generated thousands of pages of reports, and followed every lead to its conclusion. The case remained open, but with no new evidence and no viable suspects, active investigation ceased. The file was moved to the cold case archives, where it would sit for decades. The resources of the San Diego Police Department were increasingly stretched thin as the city grew and crime rates began climbing in the late 1960s. The Jennifer Caldwell case became one of dozens of unsolved murders that haunted the department, but lacked the manpower or technology to solve. In 1967, Lieutenant Morrison retired, and the case was reassigned to Detective Carl Webster, who reviewed the file but found no new angles to pursue. By 1970, with the chaos of the Vietnam era, rising drug crime and social upheaval, Jennifer's case had been largely forgotten by everyone except her family. What time is it where you're watching this? For the Caldwell family, time stopped on April 16, 1964. Even as the world kept spinning forward, Patricia Caldwell never recovered from losing her daughter. At age 41, when Jennifer was murdered, Patricia transformed from a vibrant social woman into someone who rarely left her house. Mom aged 20 years in the first month after Jenny died, Susan Caldwell Martinez recalled in a 2023 interview. She stopped sewing, stopped going to church, stopped doing all the things she loved. She was just hollow. Patricia developed severe depression and anxiety, convinced that whoever killed Jennifer was watching the family, waiting to strike again. She insisted on installing multiple locks on every door and window. She never celebrated another birthday or holiday with genuine joy. Every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, there was an empty chair at the table, Susan said, and Mom would stare at that chair like she was waiting for Jenny to walk through the door. Patricia died in 1998 at age 75. Having spent 34 years without answers about her daughter's death, Robert Caldwell dealt with his grief by throwing himself into work. He took a second job as a night security guard, partly for the extra income, but mostly to avoid being home with his thoughts. Dad couldn't stand being still, Thomas Caldwell explained. If he was working, he didn't have to think about what happened. He didn't have to feel it. Robert became obsessed with the investigation, visiting the police department monthly for updates, maintaining his own file of newspaper clippings and notes. He taught himself basic investigative techniques, reading books on criminology and forensic science. He was convinced he could solve it himself if he just worked hard enough, Thomas said. He'd stay up all night sometimes, going through his notes, making timelines, writing letters to the police department with theories. Robert suffered his first heart attack in 1979 at age 61. He survived but never fully recovered his health. He died in 1987 at age 69, having dedicated 23 years to seeking justice for Jennifer. His final words to Thomas were, "Find out who did this to your sister." Thomas Caldwell, who had been 22 and serving aboard the USS Constellation when Jennifer was killed, received emergency leave to return home for the funeral. "I felt guilty for years that I wasn't there to protect her," Thomas admitted. "I was her big brother. That was my job." Thomas completed his naval service but struggled with survivors' guilt and anger. He became involved with victim advocacy groups in the 1980s, volunteering with organizations that supported families of murder victims. "I couldn't bring Jenny back, but I could help other families navigate the nightmare we went through," he said. Thomas attended every cold case review of Jennifer's murder, presenting the investigative notes his father had compiled. He married late, at age 40, and named his daughter Jennifer Marie in honor of his sister. Now 82 years old, Thomas still lives in San Diego and continues to advocate for cold case investigations. Susan Caldwell was only 14 when she lost her sister and best friend. "Jenny was everything I wanted to be," Susan recalled, her voice breaking even 60 years later. "She was kind and brave and so full of hope. After she died, I felt like the world was a dark, dangerous place where terrible things happen to good people for no reason." Susan struggled in school, developed an eating disorder, and went through years of therapy trying to process the trauma. She moved away from San Diego at age 20, unable to bear living in the city where her sister was murdered. She settled in Phoenix, became a teacher, and dedicated her career to troubled youth. "I think I was trying to save kids the way I couldn't save Jenny," she reflected. Susan returned to San Diego only once a year on April 16th to visit Jennifer's grave at Greenwood Memorial Park. She would sit by the headstone and tell her sister about her life, about her 3 children, about the world Jennifer never got to see. "I wanted her to know she wasn't forgotten," Susan said, "that even though we couldn't get justice, we never stopped loving her." The Caldwell family established a small memorial fund in Jennifer's name that provided scholarships for nursing students at San Diego Community College. From 1965 through 2010, the fund helped 23 young women pursue their nursing degrees, the dream Jennifer never got to achieve. Every year on Jennifer's birthday, the family would gather at her grave, bringing flowers and sharing memories, keeping her alive in the only way they could. In 1985, 21 years after Jennifer's murder, the San Diego Police Department launched its first systematic review of cold cases. Detective Sarah Chen was assigned to re-examine the Caldwell file. Chen had access to improved fingerprint technology and could request new forensic tests. She submitted the blonde hairs found on Jennifer's clothing for more advanced microscopic analysis, which confirmed they came from a Caucasian male but provided no additional identifying information. The fingerprint from the doorknob was digitized and run through the California Department of Justice's new automated fingerprint system, but still yielded no matches. Chen interviewed several of the original witnesses who were still alive and re-examined all 5 of the initial suspects. None of the new leads panned out. The case was returned to the archives with a notation that it remained unsolvable with current technology. In 1999, with the advent of DNA testing becoming standard in criminal investigations, the evidence from Jennifer's case was submitted for DNA analysis. The cigarette butts from the scene yielded a partial DNA profile, but it was degraded and incomplete due to improper storage conditions in the decades since the murder. The profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, known as CODIS, but produced no matches. Detective Michael Torres, who reviewed the case in 1999, noted that the partial profile might be useful for excluding suspects, but was insufficient for a definitive identification. "We're close," Torres told the Caldwell family. "The science is almost there, maybe in another few years." But another few years came and went with no breakthroughs. In 2010, the case was reviewed again as part of a grant-funded cold case initiative. Advanced DNA extraction techniques were applied to the cigarette butts, yielding a more complete profile than had been possible in 1999. This profile was uploaded to CODIS and compared against over 13 million offender profiles in the database. Still, there was no match. Investigators theorized that the killer either had no criminal record, had died before DNA collection became standard, or had somehow avoided being entered into the system. San Diego's North Park neighborhood transformed dramatically over the decades following Jennifer's murder. The modest craftsman bungalows that had housed working-class families in the 1960s were renovated and sold for prices those original families could never have afforded. University Avenue evolved from a strip of hardware stores and soda fountains into a corridor of craft breweries, vintage boutiques, and farm-to-table restaurants. The Fox Theatre, where Jennifer had planned to see a movie the night she died, was restored and converted into a performing arts venue. By 2020, few long-time residents remained who remembered the fear that had gripped the neighborhood in April 1964. The murder influenced local policy in subtle but lasting ways. In 1965, the San Diego Police Department created its first dedicated sex crimes unit, partly in response to Jennifer's case. Schools began implementing safety programs, teaching young women about situational awareness. The City Council allocated additional funding for street lighting in residential areas. Yet as the years passed and the case remained cold, Jennifer Caldwell became a footnote in San Diego's history, mentioned occasionally in articles about unsolved crimes, but no longer part of the community's active memory. What's the weather like where you are right now? Is it sunny or are storms rolling in? The Caldwell family lived through 60 years of seasons while waiting for even a glimpse of light. March 17, 2024, at 9:42 a.m., everything changed. Dr. Margaret Foster, a forensic genealogist working with a private laboratory in Virginia called Parabon Nanolabs, sent an email to the San Diego Police Department's Cold Case Unit with the subject line, "Caldwell, 1964, potential suspect identified." Detective Lisa Ramirez, who had reopened Jennifer's case just 3 months earlier as part of a new cold case initiative, immediately called Dr. Foster. The breakthrough had come through investigative genetic genealogy, the same technique that had been used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018. Unlike traditional DNA analysis that looks for exact matches in criminal databases, genetic genealogy uses DNA to build family trees, identifying distant relatives of unknown suspects through public genealogy websites. In January 2024, Detective Ramirez had authorized Parabon to create a genetic profile from the DNA extracted from the cigarette butts found at the 1964 crime scene. That profile was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public database where users voluntarily share their DNA information for genealogical research. "We got several third and fourth cousin matches," Dr. Foster explained during a video conference with the investigative team. "From there, we built family trees going back several generations. It took weeks of painstaking work, reviewing birth certificates, marriage records, obituaries, census data. We narrowed it down to 3 possible candidates who would have been the right age and living in San Diego in 1964. One was deceased. One had been living in Europe since 1963. The third was Dr. Richard Allen Thornton. The name hit the investigation like a lightning strike. Dr. Richard Allen Thornton, age 84, was a retired cardiologist who had practiced at Sharp Memorial Hospital in San Diego for over 40 years. He was a pillar of the medical community with numerous awards and commendations. He had served on the hospital's board of directors, mentored dozens of young physicians, and donated generously to medical charities. He lived in an upscale home in La Jolla with his wife of 56 years, Margaret. He had 3 children and 7 grandchildren. He was the last person anyone would suspect of murder. Investigative genetic genealogy represents a revolution in forensic science. Traditional DNA testing compares short tandem repeats, specific sequences in DNA that vary between individuals, looking for exact matches between a crime scene sample and a suspect's profile. This method works only if the suspect's DNA is already in a database like CODIS. Genetic genealogy, however, analyzes single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are variations at specific positions in DNA. These SNPs can identify biological relationships between people, even distant cousins who share a common ancestor generations back. "Think of it like this," explained Dr. Karen Walsh, a forensic geneticist consulted on the Caldwell case. "Traditional DNA testing is like looking for one specific face in a crowd. Genetic genealogy is like identifying someone by recognizing they have their grandfather's nose, their grandmother's eyes, and their great-aunt's chin. We're using family resemblance at the molecular level. The process has a reported accuracy rate of over 99% when sufficient genetic material is available, and when the suspect's relatives have uploaded their DNA to genealogy databases. However, it requires extensive investigative work to build accurate family trees and eliminate possible candidates. This technique has given us the ability to solve cases that were simply impossible before," Dr. Walsh noted. "We're not just matching DNA anymore, we're following bloodlines through history. Richard Allen Thornton was born on July 8, 1939 in Riverside, California. In April 1964, when Jennifer Caldwell was murdered, Thornton was 24 years old and in his second year of medical school at UC San Diego. He had graduated from San Diego State University in 1961 with a degree in biology and had been accepted into one of the most competitive medical programs on the West Coast. His official records showed he had performed clinical rotations at Mercy Hospital from January through May 1964, which meant he would have been in the same building as Jennifer Caldwell, possibly passing her in the hallways. During the weeks before her death, investigators pulled Thornton's medical school records and discovered something chilling. His rotation schedule for April 16, 1964, showed he'd been assigned to shadow physicians during morning rounds from 7 a.m. to noon. But his afternoon was unscheduled, marked simply as independent study. There was no record of where he'd been or what he'd been doing between noon and 6 p.m. on the day Jennifer was murdered. In 1964, medical students had significant autonomy, and their whereabouts were rarely tracked outside of assigned rotations. More disturbing was what investigators found when they began digging into Thornton's background. He had never been a suspect in Jennifer's murder because he had never appeared on police radar. He had no criminal record, had never been arrested, had never even received a traffic citation. But when Detective Ramirez requested his medical school applications and transcripts, she discovered that Thornton had been asked to leave his undergraduate fraternity in 1959 after an incident involving inappropriate behavior toward a female student. The details were vague, buried in old administrative files, but it was clear that something had happened serious enough to warrant expulsion from the fraternity, though not serious enough to result in university discipline. If you're finding this case as shocking as we did when researching it, please hit the like button, because what comes next will completely change how you see this story. After graduating medical school in 1966, Richard Thornton completed his residency in internal medicine at UCLA, then returned to San Diego to begin his cardiology fellowship. He joined Sharp Memorial Hospital's cardiology department in 1971 and quickly established himself as a skilled and dedicated physician. Over the next 4 decades, he built an impeccable reputation. He published 17 papers in peer-reviewed medical journals. He received the San Diego County Medical Society's Physician of the Year Award in 1989. He volunteered at free clinics providing cardiac care to underserved populations. He was beloved by his patients, respected by his colleagues, and admired in his community. But there was another darker pattern that investigators uncovered when they began interviewing people who had known Thornton throughout his career. Dr. Emily Chang, who had been a medical resident under Thornton's supervision in 1985, recalled feeling uncomfortable around him. "He had this way of standing too close to the female residents," she said. "Nothing you could really report, just invasive. And he made comments sometimes about our appearance that felt inappropriate, but were always couched in language that gave him plausibility of deniability." 3 other female physicians who had worked with Thornton in different decades reported similar experiences, a pattern of boundary violations that never quite crossed the line into actionable harassment, but created an atmosphere of unease. Most disturbingly, investigators discovered that Thornton had maintained contact with the Caldwell family over the years. In 1989, when Patricia Caldwell's heart condition worsened, her primary care physician referred her to Dr. Richard Thornton for cardiac consultation. Thornton treated Patricia for 3 years, from 1989 to 1992, seeing her regularly in his office, prescribing her medication, monitoring her condition. Patricia never knew that the kind cardiologist helping her damaged heart might be the man who had murdered her daughter, Thomas. Caldwell remembered meeting Dr. Thornton at his mother's appointments. "He seemed genuinely caring," Thomas recalled, his voice thick with disgust. "He asked about our family, expressed sympathy about my sister's unsolved case. He looked me in the eye and talked about what a tragedy it was, all while knowing what he'd done." In 1994, on the 30th anniversary of Jennifer's murder, the San Diego Union-Tribune published a retrospective article about unsolved cases. Dr. Richard Thornton was quoted in that article. He'd reached out to the journalist, identifying himself as a physician who had been a medical student at the time and remembered the fear that had swept through the hospital staff when Jennifer was killed. "It's haunting to think that someone could do something so terrible and just disappear into society," Thornton had said. "I hope someday her family gets answers." It was a quote designed to deflect suspicion, to position himself as a concerned community member rather than the perpetrator. It was a breathtaking act of psychological manipulation. Dr. James Morrison, a forensic psychologist who reviewed the case, provided analysis of Thornton's behavior. "What we're seeing here is a textbook example of a highly organized, narcissistic offender," Morrison explained. "These individuals often insinuate themselves into the investigation or the victims' lives as a way of asserting dominance and control. They derive satisfaction from being close to the pain they've caused while knowing they're undetected. Treating the victim's mother, speaking to journalists about the case, these weren't accidents. They were conscious choices that fed his sense of superiority." Morrison noted that such offenders often lead double lives with remarkable compartmentalization, maintaining successful careers and seemingly normal relationships while harboring dark secrets. "The public persona becomes a mask," Morrison said. "And over time they may even come to believe their own fiction, seeing themselves as the respectable person they pretend to be, rather than as the monster they actually are." On March 24, 2024, at 6:15 a.m., a tactical team from the San Diego Police Department arrived at Dr. Richard Thornton's home in La Jolla. Thornton answered the door in his bathrobe, confused and indignant. "There must be some mistake," he said, as officers informed him he was under arrest for the 1964 murder of Jennifer Marie Caldwell. As he was being handcuffed, according to the arrest report, Thornton's first words were, "I want my attorney." He said nothing else during transport to police headquarters. A search of his home revealed nothing obviously incriminating, no trophies, no journals, no evidence he'd kept anything connected to Jennifer's murder. But investigators did find a box in his garage containing his medical school yearbooks and memorabilia from the 1960s. Among those items was a newspaper clipping about Jennifer's murder, carefully preserved for 60 years. The arrest of Dr. Richard Thornton sent shockwaves through San Diego's medical community. Dr. Patricia Lee, who had worked alongside Thornton for 15 years, told reporters, "I can't believe it. Richard was always so professional, so dedicated to his patients. This has to be a mistake." Neighbors in La Jolla expressed similar disbelief. Margaret Thornton, his wife, released a statement through her attorney declaring her husband's innocence and describing the charges as a miscarriage of justice based on flawed science. But as more details emerged, some people began to reassess their memories. A nurse who had worked at Sharp Memorial in the 1970s came forward to say she'd filed a complaint about Thornton, making unwanted advances, but the complaint had been dismissed by hospital administration. 2 former patients reported that Thornton had made them uncomfortable during examinations, though they'd never reported it at the time. The community began to grapple with a disturbing question. How many signs had been there all along that everyone had chosen to ignore? What do you think? How could someone hide in plain sight for 60 years? Share your theories in the comments. The trial of Richard Allen Thornton began on September 9, 2024, at the San Diego County Superior Court. Presiding Judge Helena Martinez had granted a change of venue request, but ultimately decided the trial would remain in San Diego with an extensively vetted jury. The prosecution was led by Deputy District Attorney Michael Reyes, who laid out the case methodically over 3 weeks of testimony. The genetic genealogy evidence was presented by Dr. Margaret Foster, who walked the jury through the painstaking process of building family trees and eliminating candidates. The DNA profile from the cigarette butts, she testified, had a 1 in 850 billion probability of belonging to anyone other than Richard Thornton. Defense attorneys attacked the methodology, arguing that genetic genealogy was untested and unreliable, but multiple forensic experts testified to its validity. Prosecutors presented evidence of Thornton's presence at Mercy Hospital during Jennifer's final weeks, his unaccounted-for time on the afternoon of April 16, 1964, and his pattern of inappropriate behavior toward women throughout his career. They argued that Thornton had encountered Jennifer at the hospital, become obsessed with her, followed her, and lured her to the vacant house on Utah Street where he murdered her. Thomas Caldwell, now 82 and in frail health, testified about his family's 6 decades of suffering. "Every day for 60 years we've wondered who did this," he said from the witness stand, his voice shaking. "Every day we've carried this weight. And all that time, the man responsible was walking around free, living his life, helping himself to a successful career while my sister rotted in the ground, while my parents died without answers." The courtroom was silent except for muffled crying from the gallery. Dr. Richard Thornton sat impassively through most of the trial, showing little emotion. He did not testify in his own defense. His attorneys argued that the DNA evidence was circumstantial, that there was no direct proof he'd ever met Jennifer Caldwell, and that the prosecution's case relied entirely on genetic technology that hadn't existed when the crime was committed. "You're being asked to convict an 84-year-old man of a crime allegedly committed 60 years ago, based on science that can't definitively place him at that house on that day," defense attorney Robert Blackwell argued in his closing statement on October 4, 2024. After deliberating for 16 hours over 3 days, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Several jurors wept as the verdict was read. Richard Thornton showed no reaction. On November 12, 2024, Judge Martinez sentenced Thornton to life in prison without the possibility of parole. "You took Jennifer Caldwell's life when she was just 19 years old, full of promise and hope," Judge Martinez said. "You stole her future, destroyed her family, and then you hid behind your professional accomplishments and respectable facade for 6 decades. The sentence of this court is that you will spend whatever time remains to you behind bars where you can no longer harm anyone." The impact of Jennifer Caldwell's case extends far beyond one family's quest for justice. Patricia Caldwell died in 1998 and Robert Caldwell in 1987, both without seeing their daughter's killer brought to justice. But Thomas and Susan Caldwell lived to see the resolution they'd been promised so many times would never come. In December 2024, the California State Legislature passed the Jennifer Caldwell Cold Case Act, allocating $15 million in funding for genetic genealogy analysis of unsolved murders. The San Diego Police Department established a cold case unit dedicated specifically to cases from the 1960s through 1980s, using advanced DNA technology to re-examine evidence that had been preserved but never fully analyzed. The Jennifer Marie Caldwell Scholarship Fund was expanded significantly, with donations pouring in from across the country after her story gained national attention. The fund will now provide full-ride scholarships to 10 nursing students annually. Jennifer's case has become a cornerstone example in forensic science training programs across the United States. It demonstrates the importance of preserving evidence even when contemporary technology cannot analyze it, the value of never closing cold cases, and the revolutionary potential of genetic genealogy. The FBI has cited the Caldwell case in training materials as a model investigation. For the Caldwell family, the resolution brought a bittersweet mix of relief and renewed grief. "We finally have answers," Susan Caldwell Martinez said at a press conference following the sentencing. "But it doesn't bring Jenny back. It doesn't give my parents the peace they deserved while they were alive. What it does do is prove that Jenny mattered, that her life meant something, and that justice, even delayed by 60 years, still matters." Thomas Caldwell died on January 7, 2025, just 2 months after seeing his sister's killer convicted. He was 82. His daughter, Jennifer Marie Caldwell Jr., said her father's final words were, "Tell Jenny we did it. Tell her we never gave up." If this case moved you, please subscribe to this channel where we cover cases like Jennifer's with the depth and respect they deserve. Share this video with someone who cares about true crime and justice. And let us know in the comments, what other cold cases should we investigate? What details stood out to you most? Your engagement helps us bring attention to victims who deserve to be remembered. Jennifer Caldwell was 19 years old when her life was stolen from her. She wanted to be a nurse, to help people, to make a difference. She never got that chance. But by sharing her story, by refusing to let her be forgotten, we honor her memory and ensure that even 60 years later, Jennifer Marie Caldwell's voice is still heard.